Why hello people of Warcraft, this is Soul and this is the final Protection Paladin video right before the Battle for Azeroth systems patch that's going to come out soon. I've done a few iterations of what is coming for Protection Paladins, and like I said, this is the final version, so I'm going to go over pretty much from the top. From the fundamental changes to the skill changes and talent changes, the Azerite traits, etc, and let's get started. Oh, and today's video is brought to you by the artist formerly known as Boners. First, the fundamentals. Pally tank magic mitigation, as well as most other tank magic mitigation, is kind of gone. No longer will your Shield of the Righteous mitigate 40+% of all damage taken, instead it's just going to give you a nice little armor buff. Now don't panic quite yet. The game for the most part is going to compensate for a good chunk of what magic mitigation that we're missing, but for the most part we're going to find ourselves relying on healers a little bit more. The global cooldown has effectively ruined the game. I'm just kidding, it hasn't ruined the game, but it is going to change a couple of fundamental things. Seraphim has been added to the global cooldown if you care about that, but the bigger additives would include Hand of the Protector or Light of the Protector, as well as Avenging Wrath. We lose some ramp up, but more importantly with regards to the nerf of Hand of the Protector, and I'll get into that just a little bit more, it's not going to be as available on a whim as it used to be. I'll be honest folks, it does kind of suck. It's going to take some getting used to. You're going to find it to be a little bit more difficult to simply heal either yourself or your teammates whenever things are hitting the fan, or at best you're going to find yourself making a more strategic decision on who you're going to heal, if at all. It adds a little bit of a frantic feeling, which I think is okay, but at the same time, it's, like I said, it's just going to take a lot of getting used to. Another big change involves our mastery. It's pretty much been redone. Before, mastery increased just our block, mitigation, as well as our attack power. It still increases our block as well as our attack power, but now it affects our consecration. I'm skipping ahead just a little bit, but consecration has been kind of revamped too. Instead of adding a buff to our Hand of the Protector as well as our Shield of the Righteous, it's going to provide a flat damage reduction. So you can count on a 10 or so % damage reduction as long as you're standing in your consecrate, and of course that's going to be increased, give or take, by your mastery. So it sounds like at the moment, mastery is going to be a pretty critical stat for pretty much any build that we put together. And as I get into the rotation, you'll see why. And finally, there's threat. Basically, tank threat in the Battle for Azeroth has gone down. As a Paladin tank, you already have a pretty strong toolkit of abilities that let you get some strong burst threat. Between popping your Avenger Shield, your Hammer, and using your Shield of the Righteous, you shouldn't have too much trouble getting some initial burst threat, whether you're in a party or a raid. This is where tank communication and control comes back into play. Your best practice would be the good old marking of targets once again. If you can control the flow of who's fighting what, you should be able to minimize the situations when someone might pull threat off of you. But let's move on to the major changes to our abilities. Avenger Shield still does what it does, but it adds a little bit more. Instead of standing in your consecrate, Avenger Shield is going to give you a temporary buff that will increase the effect of your Shield of the Righteous by 20%. I already talked a little bit about consecration, but here's a little bit more. The duration of a consecration is going to be increased to 12 seconds, while the cooldown of it is only a little over 4 seconds. This means you'll be able to reposition your consecration pretty easily. However, you can only have one out at a time. Laying down a new safe zone means the old one disappears, so you won't be able to find yourself stacking a bunch of consecrates for increased DPS. This does give you a lot of flexibility to move your safe zone, provided that you have a global cooldown to use. Because of the cooldown and the duration, consecration doesn't have a huge priority unless you happen to be moving around. So with that ability, your priority just depends on where you're at. Not having to use consecration so much frees up your judgment so you can recharge your Shield of the Righteous. I also mentioned Shield of the Righteous just a little bit, how it no longer provides a flat damage reduction, but instead an armor reduction. But the drawback is that the cooldown of Shield of the Righteous has gone up by a lot. Also, Shield of the Righteous no longer requires you to strike a target. It also does AoE cone damage, which is really cool, but this takes a little bit of getting used to. The same goes for Hand of the Protector, which is pretty unfortunate, especially since I had already mentioned that it's being put onto the global cooldown. Overall, you're going to find yourself relying on your Hand of the Protector kind of less than you did before, or at least count on it as a less occasional cooldown than you had before. So what's the experience going to be like on the field? What's our rotation going to be like these days? Just like a lot of classes work these days, our rotation is going to be more like a priority system than anything. So just keep the following things in mind. You pretty much always want to be standing in your consecration so you can get your 10+% of damage reduction. That's going to be big, especially if you happen to be taking magic damage as well. Judgment still lowers the cooldown of your Shield of the Righteous, which is going to be pretty critical, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit more when we get into the talents. Use your Avenger Shield on cooldown, but also keep in mind that you get a buff to your Shield of the Righteous. The buff lasts long enough that you don't have to sweat so much if you have to wait a few seconds before you use your Shield of the Righteous. But this is one of the things you'll be getting used to, as before in Legion you use your Judgment and then your Shield of the Righteous. Well, now it's going to be your Avenger Shield. Finally, use your Hand of the Protector whenever it's needed, and otherwise, if you're not doing anything else, either use your Blessed Hammer or your Hammer of the Righteous, whichever you have. Alright, let's get into some talent changes, shall we? There haven't been too many changes to talents, but there are a few that I'll revisit that normally I wouldn't, but with some of the other class changes that had happened, well, you'll see. Redoubt is a new talent in the level 15 tree, replacing the... I forgot what it was called actually. No one ever used it anyway, so that's okay. Redoubt will make your Avenger Shield hit one additional target, and it increases your block value by 75% for 8 seconds. Finally, we just get a talent that lets us hit more targets. In my opinion, this isn't bad, and it's a decent alternative to Blessed Hammer. But just like Blessed Hammer, it's going to be situational. You can make a build that centers around Redoubt with some Azerite traits, which I'm going to at least brush on a little bit later. But effectively, you can have a build that's kind of based on Avenger Shield, where you'll be able to hit up to 5 targets, and every target that you do hit will increase your mastery by a certain amount. Something like that is great in a situation like Mythic Plus, or any boss encounter where you encounter more than a couple of adds. Once upon a time, I wouldn't have cared too much for Bastion of Light, with the exception of maybe certain Mythic Plus or Mythic raid encounters where I needed to have that extra mitigation. In the Battle for Azeroth though, Shield of the Righteous is also an AoE attack as well as armor mitigation. Synergizing your Bastion of Light, Avenging Wrath, and your Shield of the Righteous will give you some really good burst AoE. So that might also be something to consider. Otherwise, I typically go with First Avenger, and Crusader's Judgment still feels the same way that it did in Legion, which is a little bit awkward. Unbreakable Spirit is a new talent in the 75 row, so we no longer get the damage mitigation that we did have when we would pop our Divine Steed. This does reduce the cooldown of our Divine Shield, Ardent Defender, and Lay on Hands by 30%, which is fairly significant. Considering the nerfs to the timing of Hand of the Protector, this might be a worthwhile talent to pick up depending on the fight. Consecrated Ground had a revamp. No longer does it provide a small heal, but it is slightly larger, which to be honest is not very significant. But with enemies inside being caught in the snare, the slightly larger size makes for a slightly larger room for hiding. In most other situations though, you'll find yourself using either Judgment of Light or Aegis of Light depending on your raid or your group comp. Finally, going down to Seraphim, that also has been added to the global cooldown. It does feel pretty powerful at first. Even at heroic or even mythic level raid gear, Seraphim provides a lot of secondary stats. Alright, so let's talk about Azerite gear, and to help me is a tool that I created specifically for Paladins that should help give you an idea of what sort of gear to look out for, because there are a ton of Azerite traits. Some traits matter more than others, and this particular tool is a work in progress, but I'll provide a link to it below. Azerite traits are categorized several different ways. There are up to 3 tiers of traits in each piece of Azerite gear, and within the first tier there are 2 kinds of traits. One trait is spec specific, and the other is not. Simple as that. To use this tool, all you have to do is use the pull down menu and choose the trait that you're interested in. On the right hand side, gear that possesses this trait will populate. This should help with regards to helping you hunt for the gear that you're looking for, and to eventually start building your Azerite meta. I'm going to highlight just a few of them from each tier so you can take a look at what's possible. For the tier 1 traits, we have Soaring Shield. This makes it so that your Avenger Shield will now hit 4 targets and will grant mastery per enemy hit. This is what I was talking about earlier, and you can combine this with the Redoubt talent, letting you hit 5 targets at once, giving you mastery for every enemy hit, and increasing your block value by 75%, which is definitely not bad in a large group situation, but it's probably not going to mean much in a single target situation. Keep in mind the tooltip. There are some traits that do not stack, while some do. Bulwark of Light is one example of a trait that does in fact stack. This one makes your Avenger Shield give you a bubble, very similar to the Bulwark of the Order artifact traits in Legion. If you're able to get these 3 pieces of gear, then your Bulwark of the Light will be that much stronger. You'll only find class-specific traits in Tier 1. The tier 2 and 3 traits provide some interesting utility as well as buffs, and you may choose one thing or the other depending on your spec, or just the kind of content that you want to focus on. A Blade of Shielding gives you a pretty significant amount of armor in case your health gets too low. Meanwhile, while this might not be great for tanking, Gut Ripper will let you deal extra damage to a target during an execute phase. On the tier 3 side, Long Strider can increase your run speed by up to 14%. Notice that while you can stack this on the helmet and chest, this trait is not available on the shoulder slot. Gemhide gives you a pretty considerable amount of avoidance and armor for 10 seconds. This is something that you might be able to easily stack 3 times, which would make you pretty beefy in most tanking situations. There isn't quite going to be an all-rounder set of Azerite traits for you to pick up. It all depends on the particular gameplay style, which raid, which encounter, what's your role in the encounter. The Azerite system has a promise of being a very deep system. So my hope is that the work that I put in to get the kind of gear that I want will pay off in the end because of the cool traits that I get. But we'll just have to see. So finally, that wraps up everything that's going on with the Protection Paladins in the Battle for Azeroth. I'm pretty certain that I rambled a lot, but I hope that this video was useful. If so, please like it, and whether you did or not, I would appreciate some additional input or insight to your expertise as to what kind of tips or tricks that you have for Protection Paladins in this expansion. Anyway, please like and subscribe to support the channel so I can keep giving you this and all things Warcraft. I'll see you next time. Until then, stay safe, stay happy, and stay breezy.